A student asked me why, in my lectures earlier this week, I kept on referring to the North Atlantic economies rather than to the Western economies. Why did I use North Atlantic to refer to those economies that have become vastly richer than the world average over the past 200 years? Part of it is that Western seemed out of date to me, seems no longer descriptive. Western, it comes from a time and a place when it was assumed that pretty much everything of interest was in Eurasia, and it came from a contrast between the western edge of Eurasia and everything else that was east in Eurasia, everything that was Orient, from the Latin word for east. But as of the early 1800s, Western doesn't really cut it anymore. As of the early 1800s, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and southern France were no longer among the relatively rich. And the United States and Canada were developing substantial and very, very rich populations. Hence, as of the early 1800s, North Atlantic made much more sense than did the West. But now, moving on, today, Japan, Korea, Australia and New Zealand, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan Island, very soon we hope Chile. North Atlantic itself came to make little sense. Makes little sense, and so people have been moving towards global north, and I have been moving towards global north. I am in fact kind of surprised that I used North Atlantic rather than global north last week. Maybe it was because I'm swinging around to thinking that global north is also not quite right. After all, it is not just economies located at relatively high northern latitudes that are now rich. Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan Island. As a descriptive level, however, global north's okay. But the more useful and informative label would, I think, be Dover Circle Plus. Those economies that are within a 300-mile circle of the port of Dover at the southeast corner of England, plus those economies that have received very large settler inflows from those regions, plus those economies that have strained every nerve to emulate the economic structures and patterns and practices that developed in the years 1500 after 1500 in the 300-mile circle around Dover. So, henceforth, I'm tempted to use Dover Circle Plus. I certainly would, if anyone would understand me. But there is another reason to avoid much talk of the West and the East. Over my shoulder is a map showing what Stanford's Ian Morris thinks are the economic and civilizational core areas of Western and Eastern civilization since the minus 9600. The eastern core is the Yellow and Yangtze River valleys. According to Morris, by 1900 it has gained Manchuria and Japan, and has lost Sichuan and the upper Yellow River Valley. And by 2000 it has gained Taiwan Island and the Pearl River Delta, but lost pretty much all of non-coastal China, including Manchuria. However, you could reasonably argue that there is continuity here. Continuity in population and descent, continuity in culture, continuity in politics and political orientation, continuity in civilization. But the Western core, Morris claims that from minus 9600 to 1400, it extended from Basra on the Persian Gulf to Tbilisi in the Caucasus, to Ithaca off the northwest corner of Greece, and then down to Memphis in Egypt. And from minus 250 to 250, it moved. It had added onto it Italy, Sicily, and Sardinia before retreating back to its first stomping ground. Then, from 1400 to 1800, Morris says the Western civilizational core was discontinuous. It picked up stakes and had moved to Western Europe. And by 1900, the Western core area is the American Northeast, Ireland and Britain, the Low Countries, Northern and Western France, and Northwest Germany. Truly of a movable feast. But what has the civilization of Uruk in minus 3000 What does the civilization of Uruk in minus 3000 have to do with the civilization of Silicon Valley today, in which Ian Morris teaches? In what sense are they both the West? Save that there are some people at Stanford who read the story of the man who saw the deep. That is, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, certainly there was a time in the 1800s when people wanted to tell the story of civilization as something like an Olympic torch relay race. The flint is struck, the spark is struck, and the torch lit in the Uruk of Gilgamesh and in Ur of the Chaldees. The torch is then passed down to the pharaohs of Egypt and to the Babylon of Hammurabi, before winding up in the hands of King Dawud and Salomo of Jerusalem. The torch is then passed, perhaps through Kurush and the other loyal spirit great kings of the Persian Empire. The torch is then passed to Athens and then on to Rome. In the aftermath of the fall of Rome, this kind of passing of the torch story goes. Barbarian invasions and Western Christendom then meld themselves into European feudal civilization, which picks up a torch that almost gutted out during the Dark Ages. Then the torch is handed off to the Renaissance, the Reformation, the rise of representative government and common law systems, governments that exist to secure people's natural rights and that derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, individual freedom, and then the British Industrial Revolution, and on to modern democratic capitalism, or is it capitalist democracy? But this is not really true, right? I mean, there was no single torch. And if there was a single torch, it would come along with all kinds of things we do not like at all. Thus, in some sense, I do find myself profoundly annoyed when people speak of cultural civilizational patterns rooted in the early modern imperial commercial age Dover Circle and then the Dover Circle Plus. Speak of them as the West, as the inheritors of 10,000 years of history, of unreflective believers in Western civilization, who credulously believe that people living in the Thames Valley of the island of Great Britain in the 1800s possessed as their rightful heirs an Western civilization that they have then passed on to us. There really was no common project that all of these supposed torchbearers were engaged in. And if there had been in the past, the bearers would certainly not have seen the inhabitants of the Thames Valley as in any way them or their heirs. In the minus 50s, after all, it was Roman senator and proconsul Marcus Tullius Cicero who explicitly snarked that the Britons had no silver, were too stupid to uneducated to make good slaves, and hence were not even worth imperializing. And back in the day, Athens had very little tolerance for Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, right, at least the ruling priests and the charismatic prophets had much less tolerance, for Athens. But then around the year 800, it was then that a local barbarian, a Frankish king, Charles, son of the usurper Pippin the Short, extended his military reach from his sometime capital city of Aachen, or Aix-la-Chapelle, in the Dover Circle to the Elbe River in Germany, to the Tiber in Italy, to the Ebro in Spain, and to the borders of Hungary. Pope Leo II then crowned this Charlemagne as emperor, as the first emperor dwelling west of Constantinople for 325 years. And after that, interesting things gradually began to happen between Stockholm and Sevilla, ultimately concentrating in the Dover Circle. Now, it didn't happen fast. In 800, the Dover Circle was a backwater, technologically behind, hundreds of years of technologically behind. Much of the time, the high civilizations of Eurasia and the world average. Even by 1500, you would have had to argue strangely if you wanted to argue it was really any place special. Ships and gunpowder and cannon and perhaps precision machinery like clocks aside. Yes, by 1500, the Dover Circle was no longer a backwater and was one who could claim to be one of the high civilizations of Eurasia, could rightfully claim it. Yes, it had from 800 to 1500 had a rapid creative run of growth and technological advance for a pre-imperial commercial civilization, for medieval civilization. But much of that growth was simply a Viking-raided backwaters catching up to world civilization. The Dover Circle economies did not forge ahead after 1500 in technology, faster than the world average, but they didn't forge ahead that much faster. Maybe the Dover Circle has a small technological edge on average in 1500. Perhaps 10% more than the other high civilizations of Eurasia. It certainly is developing a big technological edge in ocean navigation and gunpowder weaponry. Caravels begin to dominate the world's oceans from 1500 on. Although do note that the first great exploratory imperialist wave comes from Portugal and Greater Castile, not from the Dover Circle. But it was only ships that dominated up until 1800, and ships not always dominate. The Omani from Muscat. They threw the Portuguese out of East Africa and then ruled the coasts of the Indian Ocean from Zanzibar. And even after 1800, it was more touch and go than most histories say. The British conquered and colonized India, but they could not maintain their hold on North America. What had been a 1.1 to 1, perhaps, edge in technological progress in 1500 was only perhaps 1.4 to 1 in 1770. And indeed, even in the 1800s, the French failed in their conquest of Mexico and had a devil of a time conquering and colonizing Algeria. But it was only after 1870, then that the big change came. And then it was that the Dover Circle Plus exercised global dominance and acquired truly extraordinary, both relative and absolute, global wealth. The global wealth was primarily, although not overwhelmingly, due to technological development inside the Dover Circle Plus. But the machine gun helped too. It became the case that Dover Circle Plus societies could march anywhere and conquer anything, except for the Italians, Ethiopia, and except for the British and Russians, Afghanistan.